I believe, on the right-hand side. This is the most militarized and fortified border on planet Earth. It stretches for more than 3,000 kilometers from the Arabian Sea all the way up to the high Himalayas. It kind of turns into the line of control, carving through Kashmir and ending up just a few kilometers away from the second highest point on planet Earth, K2. And this is just one intensely militarized border in the region. This one, of course, very nearly bringing us to war this May, with two nuclear armadas now either side since the late 90s, pointing at one another. Now, if you were to move further east from here, you'll actually come across the longest wall in the world, the only one to be longer than the Great Wall of China, and that's the India-Bangladesh border. Although it doesn't look it from space or indeed on a map, it wiggles through the Bengal Delta in such a haphazardly kind of intense way that there's actually more kilometers of border fence than in any other border on Earth. And if you were to go even further east than this, you'll reach the India-Myanmar border, one of the largest border wall construction projects currently underway, I believe inaugurated by the Home Minister just a few years ago. Now, what's extraordinary is that if you go back 100 years ago today, it's not just none of these borders existed, none of these borders were even foreseen. The Raj is at its height. You've had the Victoria Memorial inaugurated in Kolkata, the kind of St. Paul's Cathedral built from the marble of the Taj Mahal, and of course Delhi is currently being built in the most ambitious architectural project that the British Empire has ever seen. Everything from Rashtrapati Bhavan, Bikaner House, Hyderabad House, and then of course all of the hundreds and thousands of Lutyens bungalows. It's an entire city that was built like Rome to remain for eternity, was the line. Little do they know that just like the Titanic which initiated construction the very same year, it would very soon collapse. What's extraordinary is that the India that we are talking about 100 years ago today is a very different one, and one that's deeply unfamiliar with us. And the best way to get this idea across to you is to look at this passport here. This is the passport of a Yemeni Jewish woman from the city of Aden. She's trying to migrate to Jerusalem in the wake of the Balfour Declaration, which has declared the Holy Land to be the homeland of the Jewish peoples. And in order to make this migration, she has to do so on an Indian passport, because bizarrely, and in a way that is largely forgotten today, any citizen of southern Yemen at this point is legally an Indian citizen, and the city of Aden, you can see which is where she's from, is at this point the westernmost city of British India. 1/3 of the Raj of India is princely states. These 560 odd semi-independent kingdoms that had handed over their defence, their foreign policy, and their communications to the Viceroy of India, but were otherwise mostly internally independent. These ranged from Kashmir, Hyderabad, Patiala, and several others, Jaipur, Jodhpur, etc. What I think very few people realise, though, is that if you open the official list of the Indian princes issued by the government of India at the time, it opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi. And it goes on to list several other states, such as Bhutan, that today one does not associate with India in the same way. Even at the Delhi Darbars, in addition to Maharajas of Madhya Pradesh, you have several princes from what's now Burma. And here is the Nizam Hyderabad, trailed by the sultans of eastern Yemen. The map of the British Indian Empire, as it was called at the time, 100 years ago today, on the day that the Indian National Congress declares its aim as Purna Swaraj, full independence from Britain, looks like this. It's a map that we are deeply unfamiliar with, and it's an India that stretches from the city of Aden in what's now Yemen, all the way to the borders of Thailand, the Shan states in what's now Myanmar. This is an area that had been kind of gradually annexed by the East India Company with no particular aim at, unifying common nationalities. It had been, joined together by conquest. And yet, since 1886 and the passing of the Interpretation Act, all of these regions had been legally defined as India, and all of their citizens had legally been defined as Indians. This includes places like Dubai and Qatar. And the story that we're going to be telling you about tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is how in the course of 5 decades, between 1921 and 1971, this enormous super colony, an empire within an empire, as it was often referred to at the time, that contained 1/4 of humanity and the largest Hindu, Muslim, Sikh and Zoroastrian populations on the planet, in the course of just 5 decades is transformed into 12 modern nation states. And the area where the Indian passport was once used becomes 12 Indian passports. These are Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. It's a story that's much vaster than we tend to realise, and yet it underlays so many of the great conflicts of the 21st century. Not just, of course, the conflict in Kashmir, which we all kind of know originates from the furies of partition, but also, for example, the Rohingya genocide that has its origins in the division of India from Burma, and would result in a list of Indian ethnicities needing expulsion being drawn up by xenophobic Burmese politicians, which included, amongst Punjabis, Bengalis, etc., a group called the Rohingya. So the story begins in India's richest and largest province, and that is Burma. It's a story that we've largely forgotten because of the way that the Myanmar military government destroyed the economy there, pulled it out of the international system, and essentially turned it into a social pariah. And yet, in the early 1930s, Burma was kind of, one of the richest economies. It was the richest province of the Raj. And Rangoon, in 1933, there's an immigration official who writes, "Until recently, New York City was the #1 immigration and emigration port in the world. Today it is Rangoon." So we've forgotten the extent to which this was absolutely central. And it remains in our collective memory in songs such as Mera Piya Gaye Rangoon, where you forget why the Piya went to Rangoon. But it's this kind of cultural moment. And within a 4-minute walk this January, I was able to walk from the largest synagogue of Kolkata Jews in Southeast Asia, through the Tamil Bazaar, past the Chola Dargah, which is a Tamil Dargah, and ending up at the Armenian church. This was one of the most vibrantly cosmopolitan places of the time, the kind of Singapore of the 1920s, if you will. And yet this creates a kind of increasing worry about gentrification, the local population being pushed out of jobs, no longer being able to afford rent, etc. Increasingly, one group of Burmese politicians, who are actually in the minority at the time, but they begin demanding separation from India. They begin demanding that Burma be partitioned off from India and become a separate British colony. They're not demanding independence from Britain, they're demanding independence from India. Now, this splits Burma right down the middle, and I think this newspaper article from The Scotsman adequately shows how unexpectedly controversial this was. Today we're so used to the idea of Burma being separate, and yet The Scotsman writes, "The attitude towards the separation question is indeed one which strikes deep into the very existence of India itself as an entity. And if one province breaks loose, no reason can be shown why similar claims by others should not be granted." And as we will see, it's this partition which will lay the foundations for all of the ones to come. Actually, Burmese politics is divided down the middle. You have the most famous politician in Burma, Mahatma Ottama. He's a Gandhian, brings the Indian National Congress to Rangoon, and he spends the latter half of his career trying to persuade people that Burma is an integral part of India. After all, Buddha's followers brought Buddhism from India to Burma, and ever since then, the Ahom dynasty had come from what's now Burma, later ruled in Assam. The Burmese Empire, when the British arrived, stretched as far as Sibsagar in modern-day Assam, and included places like Nagaland and Mizoram at the time. And various Bengal sultanates had stretched into Bengal. The divide, he argues, between the two is far less obvious than we tend to think. But he has opposition in the form of his former mentor, Mahatma Gandhi. Here is Gandhi on his tour of Rangoon the very same year as the Salt March. And Gandhi says, no, the future Indian nation that we are trying to forge is one that has its basis thousands of years ago in the Mahabharata. And it is contoured, the geographical contours of the Mahabharata, Bharatvarsh, should form the basis of a future Indian nation, not the inherited borders from the British. On April Fool's Day 1937, the first of 5 partitions carves its way through the subcontinent. A series of anti-immigration politicians take over, and as I mentioned earlier, create a list of Indian ethnicities in need of expulsion. On the basis that they speak a dialect related to Bengali, the Rohingya are added to that list, and that is later used in the crackdown just a few years ago. This is an image of the Sikhs of Bordwin, Shan State, who had been living there for about 4 generations at the time, and yet are pushed out. There are so many anti-Indian pogroms that when the Japanese invade, they decide to migrate on foot. And this is the last photograph ever taken of the Sikhs of Bordwin. This man is a major figure in the book, Uttam Singh, this man over here, with a nice jacket. And his son, Avtar Singh, would interestingly later be the first ever Sikh model for the clothing brand Mospros. Now, the bit of the book that has got the most press, I think, is this story, the Partition of Arabia, because it's again one that we are largely unfamiliar with. The fact that this entire region only really exists as separate from Saudi Arabia, because at the time when Ibn Saud was unifying the tribes of Arabia, these areas were under the protectorates of the Indian army and the Viceroy of India. They are added to the Raj, most of these regions, as princely states in 1903 by Viceroy Lord Curzon, just before the famed first partition of Bengal. And as a result, there's this kind of cultural fusion that takes place. The sultans of Oman become more fluent in Urdu than they do actually precede British imperialism. So many of the sultans of Eastern Yemen actually consider themselves jagirdars of the Nizam of Hyderabad. They consider themselves essentially vassal states of Hyderabad. And this is the origin of Halim, the great culinary masterpiece, which is essentially a Yemeni dish that was brought to the Deccan and added and mixed with Telugu spices to make the glorious concoction we know today. Here is the Nizam standing with his Yemeni jagirdars, each of them sultans in their own right in the Arabian Peninsula. But remarkably, in 1947, thanks largely to the same debates about whether India should resemble Bharatvarsh, it's decided that these states are going to be separated too. What's remarkable is the British actually encourage these states to remain part of India. But there is a quote that I found from the British legation in Tehran, who says, it was with apparent unanimity that the government of India told us that they had absolutely no interest in running the Persian Gulf states after British imperialism ended. This was Dubai at the time, and it was seen as a potential drain on the exchequer because oil had yet to be discovered. As a result, it's only actually between it's only essentially from March 1947, till August 1947, essentially just the viceroyalty of Lord Mountbatten, that the undivided India that we often think about is actually basically the actual borders of the Raj. Before that, the Arabian states were often kept off maps because of the fact that they didn't want to create a diplomatic tension with Saudi Arabia. They had an uncertain interior border. And as a result, you never see them on the maps in the way that Burma does feature and Aden does occasionally feature. But they are very much considered integral parts of India at the time, to the point that when the Gulf states are actually separated, there are mass protests in Bombay. We'll skip over this because we've got limited time. Now, the Great Partition of India will essentially overshadow these other first 2 partitions, which in a sense could have been 2 of the defining moments of 20th century history. And yet the scale of the Great Partition of 1947 would be so enormous that it remains the central moment of 20th century history in South Asia, the one that through which a quarter of the world's population continues to perceive their past, present and future through the furies that were unleashed in the year 1947. Now, one of the, I'm sure everyone here knows their partition history, but one of the things that I think is most curious and that I learnt and wasn't aware of before researching this book is that the very first pamphlet that mentions the name Pakistan, issued in 1933 by a Cambridge student called Rahmat Ali Chaudhry, uses the explicit precedent of Burma's separation to justify the creation of Pakistan. It's a domino effect, in a sense. So Rahmat Ali Chaudhry writes that it makes no sense to me why, if Burma is to be separated from India, why the Muslims of northwestern India must remain and be forced into an Indian union. This is a paraphrased version of his line. I can't quite remember the exact line, but it's something along these lines, and he explicitly uses Burma to imagination. In the wake of Direct Action Day in August 1946, the fight for Pakistan turns violent in the streets of Kolkata, and partition violence will subsequently spread up the River Ganga, first to Noakhali with massacres of Hindus in East Bengal, and then later massacres of Muslims in Garmukteshwar, just near Delhi, and then eventually, of course, to Punjab, where some of the worst violence would unfold, beginning in Rawalpindi and spreading across the region. Mountbatten arrives in March 1947, just as the Arabian states are separated. And in June, he announces that India will be divided into India and Pakistan on the basis of religious majority and minority in different districts. What I think we often look over is quite how rushed the subsequent process was. Although given a year and a half to divide the subcontinent, he decides he's going to do it in 77 days. Why? Because he wants to get it all done by the second anniversary of Japan's defeat in World War II, 15th August 1947. That's why we have Independence Day, the day that we do. And you can see the chaos and confusion that emerges as a result in this newspaper report from a month before independence. This is from the Hindu, or I'm not sure the Hindu or the Hindustan Times, can't quite remember which, but they say how India may be split up, and it's as of yet, although of course within the government it is largely known that certain provinces will be partitioned, some won't. The Hindu assumes that both Delhi and Kolkata will become a part of Pakistan, but ultimately they have no way of knowing. This is a month before independence, and they still have no idea where India and Pakistan are going to be. There's an extraordinary memoir by the satirist Fikr Tonsfi, one of the most extraordinary memoirs to survive from partition as a whole. He's a Hindu who was resident in Lahore at the time, and he writes extraordinarily about the day 3 days after Independence Day, when they finally found out that Lahore had become part of Pakistan. So it was announced 3 days afterwards, which I think, again, is often forgotten. So begins one of the great bureaucratic nightmares of history. The largest forced migration in human history begins to ensue. 10 to 15 million people displaced in the course of 9 months. 1 to 3 million people never make it. There is no other migration in history that comes close. One of the things that I talk about in this book is the fact that, surprisingly, what we refer to as the Radcliffe Line is not technically factual. We should refer to the India-Bangladesh border as the Radcliffe Line, because although he basically drew much of that, he was put in charge with dividing the provinces of Punjab and Bengal. And so this is the map that he created. He divided British India. But he did not actually ever put his pen to 82% of the modern India-Pakistan border, if we include the line of control, of course that is. But that wall that we saw at the beginning that carves its way visibly through planet Earth, he only actually draws the section between basically kind of Jammu and Sri Ganganagar. The rest emerges as a result of the decisions of princes and, of course, the attempts by men like Sardar Patel and V.P. Menon to integrate these states. It's the 20 or so border states and their decisions to basically join one state or the other that accounts for this remaining 20% of the border. Here are the princes themselves. And of course there are three major states that will burst into violence as a result of this. There's of course Hyderabad, there's Balochistan, and then there is Kashmir, and again more in the book. By the time that the ceasefire over Kashmir is announced in 1949, the rough contours of the borders of South Asia are in place. Although, remarkably, on Independence Day, this is... Although on Independence Day, the map as shown in the Partition Museum, which I'd encourage you all to go to in Amritsar, you can see on the front cover of the Hindu newspaper, the map of India is one without a single princely state having joined them. By 1949 is when the rough contours of South Asia's borders actually come into creation, and it's in 1949 that the government of India is able to print the first full maps of the border. Until that point, it was still unclear, for example, whether some Khasi states in modern Meghalaya would join India or would join Bangladesh. They were, after all, were neither Hindu nor Muslim. They were a mix of Christian and animist. So it's in 1949 that this border finally comes into place, but, of course, East Pakistan is written where today we read Bangladesh. The story of 1971, I'm again sure you all know and have lived through, but I think it's worth remembering how much in the early 1950s there was this great hope of a united Pakistani culture being possible. The Muslim League was actually founded in Dhaka, and in the early years, I think 4 of the first 8 Pakistani prime ministers are actually of Bengali extraction, or at least from modern-day Bangladesh. Here is one of the coins issued with both Bangla and Urdu written on them. But the turning point, of course, is the first military coup that appears in Pakistan. This has the effect of pushing the entirety of East Pakistan out of the country's governance. Only 2% of the military at the time were of Bengali extraction. And in a sense, from 1958 onwards, you begin to see columns written about, colonialism never ended. It feels like we're a colony of West Pakistan. And increasingly, the anti-West Pakistan kind of move for autonomy, not necessarily independence, but autonomy, begins to circulate around this man over here, Mujibur Rahman. He wins an election in 1970, 1971, the first free and fair elections in Pakistan's history. But the military famously refuses to hand over power, and in March 1971 issues Operation Searchlight, a crackdown on basically Mujib's party that includes arresting him, shooting many of his political allies, sending tanks into Dhaka University to round up student union leaders, shooting and burning down many of the newspaper presses, and in one famous case, with the flick of one man's finger, many Bengalis in the East Pakistan regiment are just shot down dead. And so begins what's known as the Liberation War, with many people who escaped this crackdown increasingly coalescing around the Mukti Bahani, the Liberation Army. Although the statistics from this time are incredibly contentious, Bangladesh would later claim with very little reasoning that 3 million Bengalis were killed. Pakistan would claim with equally little reasoning that only 30,000 people were killed. What we do know is that in the course of a single year, 1971, an estimated 10 million individuals have become refugees in both India and Myanmar, the 2 countries bordering East Pakistan. This is a number roughly equivalent to the displacement in 1947 as a whole across the subcontinent, but this is, in one small corner of the subcontinent. 1 in 12 Pakistani civilians becomes a refugee in the year 1971. And of course this finally ends in December 1971 when the Indian army rolls into Dhaka. with the signing of this pen, Bangladesh as a modern nation state comes into being. And it's the 12th of 12 nation states to emerge from what was once a single Indian empire. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's a bit late, but thank you all for coming this evening. And, you know, when we were watching this presentation that Sam has just put together, it reminded me that the Tribune newspaper has actually covered a lot of these events. You start with 1886, Sam, which is the Interpretation Act, and I think if some of you would look into the archives of our newspaper, you would find stories on that. Now, these 5 partitions that you talk about, and of course the great partition of India and Pakistan again, General Malik said he was born before partition as Justice Sodhi, one of my trustees, the trustee of the Tribune newspaper, and some other people, Mr. Mahajan, sitting right here in the front rows. So I think this story of the migrations that you talk about is very much alive here, especially in Punjab, and you know, we're within spitting distance of the border with Pakistan. But tell us, but one of the things that I noticed about your book, and which I thought was interesting, is that you say that none of these partitions were inevitable. Why do you say that?
Quickly, just thank you, and I just wanted to say, with regard to the Tribune, that the Tribune is footnoted many times in the footnotes, so do look out for that. So, in a sense, I think the reason that I open the book where I do in the late 1920s is because that is the last moment when none of these partitions are inevitable. It's a moment when there are debates about where the future should go. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a Burmese monk who is, you know, running the Indian National Congress of Burma, later becomes Savarkar's predecessor at the Hindu Mahasabha, and argues for an Indian nation that stretches all the way east. What I haven't mentioned so far is that there's also a character called Muhammad Ali Luqman, one of the great Arab journalists in Aden at the time, who likewise writes of a potential future where the Arab states are integrated as part of a future Indian nation, and where Arab is an Indian ethnicity alongside Telugu, Punjabi, Bengali, etc. And so, in a sense, there are a series of key moments that I consider the kind of sliding doors moments in the book. I think beyond 1931, and the Great Depression, and this uprising in Burma, where the Indian army is sent to suppress, essentially turning public opinion against Indians somewhat. You know, there's a series of moments like that where everything changes and the possibilities that were previously there suddenly diminish. So, of course, you know, it would have been an uphill battle to try and unify this entire region, and it was an idea that was common amongst very few people. But the fact that there were so many people arguing for that is interesting in and of itself. I think that, for example, the partition of 1947, I argue, only becomes inevitable as late as August 1946, with the collapse of the Cabinet Mission Plan. There is a strong sense, when you read the archives, that this last-ditch attempt to try and basically keep India together very almost worked. Jinnah accepts it. The idea would have been that India and Pakistan exist in a kind of federated system based along the United Kingdom. So in the UK, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are all recognised as separate nations, but not separate nation states. And that's a kind of weird legal kind of way of resolving these two separate demands, and that was essentially one of the suggested ways to grant Pakistan within an Indian Union. So there's a series of moments like that, after which suddenly, you know, after the violence emerges on Direct Action Day, I don't think that there was any possibility of keeping India united after that. But until that point, there could have been some sort of deal worked out.
But you know, the Indian Union, and that's one of the partitions that you talk about, is when the 565 Indian princes come together to form the Indian Union. And of course, there's 12 states that form the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Now, that almost didn't happen. B.P. Menon, you make him a hero in your book, who I think Mountbatten puts a gun to his head and says, okay, now put this together. So tell us a little bit about that. How did that happen?
Sure. There is this extraordinary thing that although the British tried throughout the 1920s to basically integrate several of the princely states into some sort of federation, they do so rather slowly and without really forcing and twisting any wrists. And then, well, happens and everything's put into cold storage, quote. And so by the time that World War II ends, there is still bizarrely no constitutional link between British India and Princely India. Of course, you know, the reality is such that none of these states, or very few of these states, would have been any sort of viable state. Famously, the smallest princely state was Vajranones, where the entire state's population could fit into a single photograph, because it was basically a glorified estate.
But tell us about this little state outside Delhi, which wanted to, okay, I won't give the story away, but there's a little kingdom or a little principality just outside Delhi which wants to join Pakistan. Tell us about it.
Sure. I mean, this is the great fascinating thing, is that far more states trying to do different things than we'd expect than I think we tend to realise. Dujana is in Haryana, it's about an hour and a half from Delhi, was once one of these kind of small Pathan states, a bit like Patodi, which, you know, Saif Ali Khan's family comes from. One of these small little Pathan states of 30 hamlets just outside Delhi. And the Nawab of Dujana announces in 1947 that he's going to join Pakistan. And it becomes the only state to be rejected by Jinnah from joining Pakistan, because Jinnah announces that you don't have an airport, there is no way for us to get anything to you, you don't have the budget to build an airport, and you're not near the sea and you're not near the border. So, but you are about 20 kilometres away from Delhi, and we'll probably end up in a lot of trouble with the Indian government if we accept. And so there's all sorts of fascinating little stories like this. Subsequently, I think the entire Muslim population of the state move to Pakistan by train, and the Nawab of Dujana disappears from the story. We don't know what happened to him. There's all sorts of rumours in Dujana today. Some say that he created a dhaba and regretted his decision, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. I've found there seems to be lots of kind of folklore stories. One has him kind of drowning in a lake, and yeah.
Well, so Dujana was not allowed to go to Pakistan in a sense, perhaps because of the contiguity principle as well, wasn't it? But then there was Junagadh that almost joined into the Kashmir story. Everybody, our audience knows that well. But the question is that Nepal and Bhutan, which were never formally part of the Indian Empire or the British Indian Empire, retained their kingdoms, if you like. But Hyderabad doesn't.
So this is, I think, one of the things that a lot of people don't realise again. The Nepal and Bhutan both appear in lists of princely states, and in the 1909 map of the Indian Empire do appear likewise on the map of India. Nepal and Bhutan both have interesting deals with the British, such that no one's quite able to square the circle. They created an agreement with the British that they will be independent states under the protection of the Viceroy of India, and basically become de facto princely states, even though to legally recognise them as such would be in contravenence of this agreement. So they appear, according to the Interpretation Act, they are princely states, but according to the actual agreement that's signed, they aren't. And no one's ever able to square the circle. There's a brilliant scholar called Swati Chola who's working on this at the moment, and what she finds is that there's actually a legal case that the rulers of Nepal, Bhutan and Sikkim put together to basically the British government and the Muslim League and the Congress, basically petitioning the fact that, they should be regarded as a separate case from the rest of the princely states. Rest is the crucial word, because they even recognized at the time that they were sort of pseudo-princely states. So in the book you'll see I call them informal princely states. It's the same status, incidentally, that Oman had, and a lot of the legalese that's used within the Raj talks about Oman and Nepal being analogous systems. Both were independent states under British Raj's protection. But they basically prove in the court of law that that Himalayan states should be regarded as separate and be allowed to retain their independence after 1947. Incidentally, it seems that that is actually the reason why the Maharaja of Kashmir thought it possible to obtain his independence, because the legal document says, you know, as a Himalayan state you are allowed to retain your independence. The Maharaja of Kashmir famously then announces in the aftermath of this that he wants Kashmir to be the Switzerland of the East, and that it will join neither India nor Pakistan. And then of course events move ahead of
So
themselves.
one prince or another is actually making use of the precedent that happens before. So for example, you said that Burma, you know, that a lot of the sort of states in Pakistan, or what became Pakistan, said that if Burma can become independent, then so can we. Jinnah said that, or Rahmat Ali Chaudhry said that before Jinnah said that. So it was inevitable, wasn't it?
So I don't think that the integration of the princely states in the way that happened was inevitable. So I think that, you know, there was some sense that they would probably end up becoming part of India in some sense, or at least some of them would. But I think one of the extraordinary things is how many states negotiate essentially with the other side. Most of the list that we use in our textbooks, etc., is based off the account of V.P. Menon, where he lists 6 particular states who do so. But for example, Manipur negotiates to join Burma for a bit. 20 states do actually join Burma, and we forget about those 20 the Shan states, who I showed the picture of at the beginning, are princely states. Dilir, in what's now Pakistan, negotiates briefly to join Afghanistan before deciding on Pakistan. Jodhpur and Jaisalmer both negotiate with the Pakistani government what they could get if they join Pakistan, later decide not to, but the fact that they even enter into negotiations tells you something. And likewise, both Pawalpur and Khairpur, that join Pakistan, briefly negotiate with Nehru to see what they could potentially get if they joined India. There's far more agency on the part of the princes throughout this period than I think we tend to give credit for. And I think one of the most wonderful stories that I came across, and that is completely unknown outside the region, is the story of the Khasi states of Meghalaya, south of Shillong. There's a series of states that actively do join Pakistan. They send in a letter saying we'd like to join Pakistan, right? Muslim, and they made their decision simply based on the fact that their states' economies were more tied to the markets around Sylhet, and, you know, it would be better for them to, you know, their